what's one of my main focuses is, of course,
we'll get going as soon as the clock ticks up to top of the hour. Good morning, everyone. Today's May 16th, 2024, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everyone who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great presentations. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And in the roughly 4 years we've been doing these programs, our audiences have been so generous in contributing in honor of our great speakers. One of my favorite parts of the program every week is when we announce the running total of just how much the audiences have contributed. And today I am delighted to tell you that our running total is $572,427.74. Thank you all so much for these incredibly generous contributions. Today we have another great presentation for you, Mark Danis. Mark is Vice President, Deputy General Counsel of the Clorox Company, where he oversees the areas of litigation, cybersecurity, privacy, marketing claims, employment counseling, and government investigations. Mark has deep crisis management experience, leading and setting the strategic direction for responses to cybersecurity incidents, global product recalls, government enforcement actions, and other business disruptions and transformations. Mark, we are very much looking forward to this. Since you're from the Clorox Company, I won't say you're going to give us a down and dirty look at conflict resolution and mediation. Rather, I'd say we're expecting you to come clean with us and tell us exactly what you think. So please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're able. And then on with the presentation. Mark Danis, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jeff and Natalie, and good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Danis, Deputy General Counsel of the Clorox Company, joining you from our wonderful offices here in Oakland. Jeff, appreciate the little joke about the company. It's hard to talk about our company and not get some sort of a rise of humor. Yeah, so this morning, for those who can, we would love to see a contribution to the Alameda County Community Food Bank. They are an organization here in the San Francisco Bay Area. They've been around for a number of years. Clorox has been deeply involved with them. We're a member on their board. And I think what I can say about them is I've been there myself. I've participated as a volunteer. They serve meals to members throughout the Alameda County area. Last year, they served over 45 million meals to folks in the Alameda County area. They had 9,000 volunteer hours, and they do all this working through like about 400 community agencies and partners. So I mean, it is having been to their warehouse and worked to put together the meals. It's a company in and of itself, and it is extremely well run. 95% of the donations that are made go directly to the meals themselves. So I can't speak highly enough of them and appreciate anyone who's able to make a contribution.
Thank you.
Great. Good. So on with today's presentation. As Jeff said, I'm at the Clorox Company, and before that, I was at Morrison & Foerster for 25 years as a civil trial lawyer and litigator. I've been at Clorox about 9 years now. And so it can offer the perspective, a little bit of both having been as outside counsel, but now in-house counsel, and hope through this morning's discussion to give a little, I don't know, some nuance, if you will, from the inside counsel's perspective. I'll start by talking about some table stakes, if you will, for any mediation that I think will be things that are familiar to most folks. But then I hope to talk about a few things that I think bring a little emphasis, if you will, to how I have to navigate things on my side and my colleagues here at the company do when we're involved in matters. And then I think the final thing I'll say, just by way of introduction, is, big company, $7 billion in revenue. We have a lot of different brands. So the spectrum of our litigation is very, very broad, everything from false advertising, employment litigation, business to business disputes, some government matters. It's a pretty broad spectrum. And so the types of mediations that we participate in are similarly pretty varied. I guess the final thing I'll say by way of just background is, I'm speaking on behalf of myself today, not on behalf of the company. I'm sure that's understood, but just wanted to make sure I included that. All right, so in terms of table stakes, I think the few things I'll touch on include the goals of the mediation through the eyes of in-house counsel, the timing of mediation, which I know is a familiar subject, and then a little bit about selecting a mediator. The goals of mediation, obviously can be many, and can take place at different points. But I think, as I think about it, it can be, obviously at times there can be an interest in settling a case. Not surprising. That's why many people go to mediation. Other times, critically for us, it's an opportunity to know enough about the case and learn enough about the other side to have a better evaluation of the matter. Because typically there may have been some discoveries, some pleadings filed, but we're looking to kind of cut to the chase a little bit and learn a little bit through mediation to help advise the business on a little bit deeper on a matter and how we evaluate it. And then I guess the final thing I would offer is, again, not surprising, we're looking to sometimes to know what's the bottom line number potentially from another side if we're the defendant in a case. That'll help the business kind of anchor their thinking around, okay, we're going to spend a certain amount on litigating. The other side's offering blank. We're hearing from our lawyers, this is a case of, no merits or, maybe some merit in front of a jury. Hard to know how it'll come out, or an arbitrator. So something that will anchor their perspective financially on a case. So one of the other goals of our mediation, going into a mediation. In terms of the timing of the mediation, again, nothing surprising here. Oftentimes, like many, we would want to be looking at and considering mediation at a point in time when there's enough either information that's already been exchanged, that we can have a better and more informed point of view on a case. Having said all of that, we have situations where we are willing to consider mediation early on at the very outset. That can be for different reasons that are specific to the type of case it is. And even in those situations, we'll typically, push for a fulsome exchange of information. It may be, sometimes it's a one-way exchange. It's like, we really need a lot of information from the other side, or vice versa. But there are occasions when we're willing to consider mediation early on. It's not a sign of weakness from our perspective. Again, it's an information gathering exercise, and of course it's voluntary, so we don't have to strike a deal at a mediation if it's not something of interest to us. In terms of selecting a mediator, from our perspective, it's critical. If we're in a case that's going to trial, what's my main focus? It's the judge, it's the jury. If we're going to have a mediation, what's one of my main focuses is, of course, it's the mediator. For us, I guess I start with, credibility. We need a mediator that, myself, our outside counsel, and then ultimately, in some sense, our business colleagues trust and have faith in terms of their points of view, their thoughts during the course of a mediation and what they're sharing with us. And, we size that up in lots of different ways. We obviously, not surprisingly, get input not only from our immediate outside counsel on a matter, but we work with a network of firms, so we will gather as much information as we can about a mediator, their background and experience, and how they've performed in other settings that might be comparable to the one that we'll be going into. I'd say the other really important thing, for me, in a mediator is their tenacity. Um, mediation is, it's not always a one-day affair, as many of you know. And having a mediator who can show a lot of tenacity through the day and through the days or weeks that follow is critical for us. It's not often, but occasionally I'll encounter a situation where a mediator um, seems to, be throwing up at his or her hands early on in the day. And like, I've just done too many mediations to know that that's just, it's not the day can go on and on and on. And all of a sudden, the levee can break and there'll be some sort of movement, whether it's financially or exchange of information that can really change, the outcome and trajectory of the mediation. So having a mediator that'll hang in there and is not simply an arm wrestler, somebody who really can, substantively know the area well enough that he or she can comment on how a court or a jury might perceive the matter. So, substantive knowledge, again, next to tenacity and credibility, is high on our list. I guess a couple of other topics that I wanted to touch on include, who attends the mediation, preparing that team or person who attends with us, what I need from the other side in terms for a successful mediation, and then some other things that are very particular to sort of the in-house side of the equation. When we think about who attends the mediation, for me, it's a lot about kind of ensuring that, if typically it's a business dispute of some sort, that the relevant, we pick somebody that they may or may not have to know the details of the particular dispute, but I want somebody there who's going to, from the perspective of the business, not simply from the perspective of the lawyer. As we go through the day, as we go through the process leading up to the mediation, become invested in a way so that when a decision is made, whether it's to settle or to not to settle, that they feel like, they're not something that their voice has been heard, but hopefully that they're in agreement with the direction that we're taking in a mediation. My job is to represent the company, obviously, and but ultimately the dispute involves something that happened within the company. If it's going to be resolved in financial terms, it's going to involve, a payment from some part of the company. And it's critical for me to know that the business feels good about the outcome of the mediation, whether it's resolved or not. I mean, it's not, I'll have a reaction to how the day went. I'll have a reaction to, how the matter did or didn't resolve. But almost more important to me is, how did the company feel about it through the eyes of my business colleagues? Are they satisfied with it? So that's, I don't know. So when I'm picking who's going to attend, I'm thinking about that. I might need somebody who's got, information that's relevant to the day, but I want somebody who's going to be the voice of the company and feel like they're invested. In terms of preparing for the mediation, and I'll put aside things like the mediation brief, and yes, I think they're important, and they've got to orient the mediator. And I typically do want an exchange of mediation briefs because I want to know, I don't know, what's the best case the other side has. Maybe I haven't heard it all through my outside counsel. I want to know that. I'm grown up. I can judge it for myself in terms of whether it's the other side's position is overstated. And even when it is, what are the points that they're going to be able to make? But in preparing, my team and typically some business colleagues, most of them have not been through mediation before. So, you're starting from scratch a little bit. It's like preparing a witness for deposition or trial who's never testified before. So obviously I'm giving them the ins and outs on the process itself, making sure they understand it's completely voluntary. It's not unusual for a business colleague, not surprisingly, to walk into mediation, and because you'll have a mediator with gravitas, perhaps they're a former judge, but they might feel like, ooh, this is important. I've got to commit during the course of the day to some outcome. And it's like, no, hold on. This is completely voluntary. Yes, there are going to be people there with, roles and there's some theater, if you will, but making sure they understand it's completely voluntary. Of course, making sure they understand that the mediator has a role to play. They're there to see if they can bring the sides together to reach an outcome, and that needs to be kept in mind in terms of obviously how we communicate with the mediator, what we communicate with them. They're not, the mediator's not on our team, if you will, obviously. They're in the middle, if you will, and just making sure our business colleagues understand that, so that when we do want them to participate at the mediation, they're doing it in a way that's measured, and we've helped them understand when we need them to participate and how we want them to participate. I think one point I've touched on is going into a mediation and thinking about our own position, how we're evaluating the case. As an in-house lawyer, I have to take into consideration, maybe one of our particular brands is involved in a dispute. And you all know we've got many brands. I won't make this an advertorial, but obviously our Clorox bleach, everything from that to Hidden Valley Ranch dressing, Kingsford charcoal, Fresh Step kitty litter, our wipes, Brita water filters. We have lots of brands. Typically, it's oftentimes a particular brand that's involved. And there might be an issue that, it's particular to the brand, but maybe it also involves what I would call like an enterprise-wide issue of some sort. So there can be occasions when, there could be a divergence between the interest of the particular brand and the enterprise. So one of my roles going into the mediation is to kind of know and understand those cases where we have to view things through multiple lenses, like what could be best for the brand. Maybe it's fighting, it's not settling, or it's settling on terms that are blank. What are the considerations for the company overall, reputationally or otherwise, if it's a public dispute, and how are we viewing resolution through those terms? So I've got to think that through in advance. Make sure that when we're at the mediation, we've got a unified perspective that takes into consideration not only the particular business at issue, but, if you will, the enterprise considerations, if in any way they diverge from the business. I think, going into the mediation, what do I need from the other side? It can vary, but, the one thing I would say that at times can be lacking, which can make it difficult, is client control, if you will. And I'll commit that when I go into a mediation, we have client control. Like, we may have had lots of heated discussions behind the scenes, but when we go in, we're unified. We have a perspective, and we can speak on behalf of the company, and there's complete client control. At times, I've been to mediations where that doesn't appear to be the case on the other side, and that's just unfortunate, but that's one of the things I need from the other side. And not surprisingly, even though at times a good part of the day can be spent talking dollars and cents at a mediation, we do want to engage on the merits. We do want to know that this has been thought through seriously, not only through the eyes of the mediator in terms of the merits, but from the other side. That's important to us because you won't be surprised to hear me say this. We feel like we're faced a lot of times with frivolous litigation, and we've got to wrestle through that. And we're happy to offer our own perspective on the merits. We need the other side to be able to do the same. A few final thoughts. Something I probably didn't fully appreciate until I came in-house, and this varies by company, and this might be more specific to a public company. But if we're going to go into a mediation, and as the many mediators on this call would require, we need to come in with somebody who has authority. We'll typically already have some dollar amount of authority. Not always, but typically we will already have thought that through, and that can obviously change during the course of the day. No surprise there either. But that has implications, within a public company, when you get that authority, you, depending on the particular situation, you may have to take a, what's called a financial reserve for that authority. So you're already potentially, putting some numbers on your books to recognize the authority, whether or not it's settled. So I kind of offer that for the in-house lawyers on the call to and they may already be self-evident, but it was something that I certainly had to think more through as I, joined Clorox and was walking through my first mediations. Know and understand what are the financial implications of getting authority in advance of the mediation, and have that in mind. I think this is the final thing I wanted to share out, which is, considering the public relation aspects of a matter going into mediation. There are, of course, many matters that go into mediation where there's not going to be any PR consequences, settled on confidential terms, not uncommon. Occasionally, the matters aren't even filed lawsuits, so again, it's confidential. Situations where it is a public lawsuit, it might settle, and unless somebody takes particular notice of it when a dismissal is filed, there may be no PR consequences. But of course, we do have matters that settle where maybe it's a threatened or a filed class action, and we have one that recently resolved, if you will, involving one of our brands, and there's a hearing in a few days next week for the judge to approve the settlement. But going into the mediation, we had to think completely through the public relations aspects of the settlement, because we knew, we would settle it at our mediation or thereabouts, and then it would come out through a motion for approval of the settlement. So being able to work for the in-house lawyer, being able to work closely with your public relations team, both within the company and potentially outside of the company, in a matter, in one of these recent matters that involved a product recall, all of the nuances of how would the product recall interface with the settlement of the false advertising class action, and how would you ensure that you, as consumers, were learning not only about the product recall and their rights to exercise, under the product recall, but now their rights to exercise under a class action settlement. How do you communicate with the consumers and make sure that everyone's got, the right information, that it's clear to them? So I think, it's not often, but there are matters where there's a lot of thinking that has to go through around the communications aspect of the settlement, and then going into a mediation, if you think you're going to reach a resolution, that the in-house lawyer has to think through. Obviously working with their outside counsel, but many times it's working with, as I said, the public relations team within the company, and potentially outside of the company if it's going to get some broader pickup. So those are some of my thoughts, Jeff and Natalie, to offer for today. And now I'm happy to kind of, go into a dialogue, if you will, around some of the issues either that I've raised or that, might be on your minds or those of others.
Mark, thank you. This was just tremendous. So much here. I do have a few questions. Let's dive in. You talked about client satisfaction and how important it is that your underlying business clients be satisfied with the mediation. And there's a lot of dimensions to that. We want them to be satisfied with the process, with the result, and of course with the performance of you and the other lawyers along the way.
Right.
What are the things that contribute most strongly to client satisfaction, and what are the things that detract from client satisfaction that we all should work to avoid?
Right. I would say, in terms of the mediator, I hesitate to say empathy, but certainly an understanding of the company's position and an acknowledgement of it is important. I think, absolutely detracting is when our business colleagues get the impression that the other side is either ill-prepared, or it's only about the money, or there's something about, and oftentimes we don't spend a lot of time at a mediation with opposing counsel, but there can be occasions where there are interactions. So I think ensuring that the other side is showing up in a way that's respectful and acknowledgement of the company's position is important. And I think it is sort of unusual for our business people to go through the day and realize, wow, this ultimately many times boils into a negotiation. They're not as much as you can try to prepare them for that. It's a little eye-opening, if you will, that at least justice on the mediation floor can become just a financial negotiation once all of the important points are exchanged on the merits. So there's no particular pro tip there, but I think just an awareness that for many, the process, particularly the negotiation aspect, is eye-opening and surprising in some ways.
Eye-opening in the sense that many times we spend a lot of the day just bargaining back and forth.
Yeah, exactly.
Why is that so surprising?
It's just not something they've been through before. In other words, they're faced with a legal dispute. They know it, and they're familiar with courts and processes, and maybe they might know something about a motion or two. But I would say, 9 times out of 10, the business colleague that I'm bringing into that mediation has never been through the process before. And it's not surprising because they haven't heard it. It's just living it is the surprise. It's like, wow, this was pretty interesting. And they'll walk out of that day.
So a lot of us, Mark, as mediators, like to have conversations with lawyers before the mediation. Do you try to bring your clients into that, to have your clients chat with the mediator a bit before the mediation so that we can establish some rapport and some chemistry and perhaps help orient the client to the fact that we may be spending a lot of time just bargaining and trading numbers?
Right. Well, first of all, the practice of having the conversations in advance is fantastic. It's huge. It doesn't always happen, but it should happen more. So because it helps cut through a lot of the stuff at the beginning of the day that might be a waste of time. So one or multiple conversations with both counsel before the mediation, obviously huge from my perspective. It's not often actually that we've included our business colleagues in those conversations, but hearing you voice it, I could see value to that. My impression has been there are times, not surprisingly, where the mediators maybe don't want the real client there. They may not even want the in-house lawyer there because they're worried the in-house lawyer is going to be jockeying. But I think it's a great point, Jeff, and a point well taken in terms of value being obtained through that.
Yes, I wish people would do it more. Now, Mark, you also talked about empathy and understanding of the client's position. The mediators need to show that in order for clients to have satisfaction with the process. How do you distinguish that from mediators expressing agreement with the client's position?
Right. I suppose it's nuanced. If I were a mediator, I don't know that it's too difficult to pull off. I think you obviously know during the course of the day, the mediator is going to absolutely have to lean in and say, well, of course, you have to understand and realize that this is litigation, and I get your point about this contract provision, or I get your point about why you don't think this phrase on the bottle is false advertising, but please understand, X, Y, and Z. I think it can be as simple as I could see that position. I've seen that position before. Sometimes I've even seen it prevail, but not always. Just some way of signaling, not only that you get it, but you also see the merit in it. Doesn't mean you necessarily agree with it. And of course, the mediator can always voice. It's always it's not my role here today to say who's the winner or the loser, but to give you the best information possible for you to decide whether you want to roll the dice with a judge or jury on this.
Now, what are some nice ways for mediators to communicate that you may just have a loser on your hands here if a client is not really.
Well, you're getting to my you're getting to my favorite part in some ways, because you know I feel like I have a good ability to know when, the value of our case and when we have a problem. It's frustrating, I would admit, when I feel like the other side's case is a loser, and it's not clear to me whether that's been communicated through the mediator. I may be losing your original question, but I think if the mediator, look, we need the mediator with credibility and not simply with bravado to call it like he or she sees it. Now, I suppose that can be hard for the mediator because you're trying to like keep the other side tight and not, rain too much on their parade. But I look, even if the mediator tells us you've got a loser of a case, I'm going to have a perspective on it, and I'll be able to talk with my client afterwards and say, if I think how I view that point of view. But I don't. I think there are times where I've really wanted that to be expressed to the other side, and it wasn't always clear to me that it had been.
Mark, with respect to client control, because this does touch on the topic of client control, when perhaps well, it's probably never happened to you, but maybe when you were at MoFo, you had some partners who may once or twice have had a client with unrealistic expectations. Who knows?
Right.
Are these the sorts of things that you are comfortable discussing with the mediator in a preparatory call and enlisting a mediator's help and perhaps helping bring a client's unrealistic expectations back down to planet Earth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's not something that I've experienced here, but I think it's a great point that the mediator can play that bridge role at times, because obviously, how a client, their relationship with their counsel can vary, and it may be that for whatever reason the lawyer has an inability to rein that client in to some extent. So the mediator might have that ability to provide, as I said, the bridge, if you will, where needed.
And also in the preliminary conversations that you might have with the mediator, these issues of, shall we say, the multiple lenses, I think that's the phrase you used. There may be the individual brand, the overall enterprise. How important is it for mediators to understand these political complexities, shall we call them?
Right.
And how candid are you with mediators about that sort of thing? And what do you expect mediators to do to help you with those sorts of challenges?
I would say it's probably a little more behind the curtain. Like, in other words, it would be pretty unusual that I would need, in my situation, a mediator's help to navigate that. I would say I raise that more as a pro tip for the in-house lawyers to make sure that they've been able to think through the different lenses of what are the implications of the case, and is resolving it for one part of the business in any way detrimental to the enterprise. I wouldn't be opposed, to having the mediators help if I thought there was some sort of tension that I couldn't resolve, but I would see that as my job to have resolved that and thought that through and worked that through in advance. Like, if that requires, for example, if the enterprise's position is in tension with the particular business unit, that is something that can and should be sorted out within the company in advance.
And that's really more of a private matter rather than something in which you enlist the mediator's assistance. Is that right?
I would view it that way. Yes.
But definitely in particular cases might be high on your private checklist for preparation.
Yes. Yes.
So let's look at the topic of candor more broadly. You said that the mediator is not necessarily a member of your team. How candid are you with mediators, and what is your view of mediation? Is it a place where people really just let down their guard and let it all hang out? Is it more strategic? How do you view that whole range of subjects?
Well, I'm pretty sure I said the mediator is not on our team.
Mhm.
I have to, knowing that the mediator is gauging my reactions to the day and to the numbers and to the mediator's input on the case. I would say I'm measured in what, where I feel I can be, if you will, completely transparent. I'm measured on that. I am, it is, one of my greatest colleagues at MoFo, Jim Brosnahan, he was a poker player. He is a poker player. And I've never played with him, but I'm pretty sure he's a good one. And, he views things through that lens when he needs to. And I'm not a poker player, but I know that, there are a lot of cues in a mediation beyond just the numbers, and you have to be very careful. And the mediators, obviously, in trying to be as effective as they can, they're 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 trying to work each side and look for all of those cues. So any misstep, could send a signal that is, could be disadvantageous to what I'm trying to accomplish. So it's a long-winded way of saying I'm careful, and yeah, I'm careful.
Well, that makes sense. And in terms then, Mark, of learning and viewing the mediation as a learning experience, which I think is a very productive and beneficial way to look at mediations. Let's talk about the way that people do get educated, and specifically whether the sides talk directly to each other or whether the mediator ferries messages back and forth all day.
Right.
How much direct interaction, if you can generalize, do you want, either through joint sessions with all hands involved, private conversations with counsel on the other side? How
Right.
do you view the topic of direct communication as a means of getting education in the mediation?
Right. I'll start by saying, in early in my career, it was not unusual for the mediation to start with a joint session, and not surprising for there to be presentations, slides or PowerPoints, and for the right case, even today, that could be appropriate, right? And particularly complicated cases, a patent case, for example. It's more my experience now that the mediations, after an exchange of mediation briefs and whatnot, and maybe some phone calls with the mediator in advance, start with, other than maybe some handshakes with the other side at the beginning of the day, it's like you're immediately, broken out into rooms. I have been fine with that for the most part. What I've seen happen, not uncommon, is that at some point in the day, there may be a need. It could be on a fact issue. It could be on a financial component of what's under discussion, for there to be direct interaction. I'm always open to it, and at times it feels like, because you've been sitting in that room for so long, you just need you need to bring a little life into the day, perhaps, or maybe you need to have an exchange with the other side so that they really see that you mean what's been communicated during the course of the day through the mediator, and that's really your position. That's really perhaps your bottom line, and you mean it. So I feel like it has been and can be effective, and my experience of late it's been laser. It's been like, there's a 15-minute need for it at a right point, and then it's effective. That's how I view that, Jeff.
Okay. Mark, another thing that you mentioned in going over with your business clients, your perspective on the case, you talked about how much it would cost to litigate, or in your situation, by and large, defend a case. Mediators oftentimes get sharp reactions from people when we talk about the costs of defense. we get sharp reactions. Oh, that comes out of a different budget, or just because it's going to cost me money to defend it doesn't mean I'm going to pony up all that money to them.
Right.
And yet you raised it right up front as something that almost necessarily gets taken into account. Can you unpack that a little bit for us about how costs of defense really does figure into your thinking,
Right.
and better and worse ways for mediators to introduce that element into the conversation?
Right. There's a spectrum of cases that face us, from completely meritless to ones where we've got to pause and think about it. But any sophisticated company, whatever they want to tell you at a mediation, is going to be thinking about what the cost is, and maybe for, as you know, for some companies, because it's a different budget, maybe the person who's at the mediation can say, with confidence, well, that doesn't bother me. But it's probably going to bother somebody, if you will. And I think for us, in a situation where we think we have the other side dead to rights, or if it's a repeat player that we're dealing with, which can sometimes happen, the cost of litigation might be like, absolutely, it's there and we don't care. So that can be the case. But in other situations, it's a component. And I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets to say it's a consideration that has to be taken into account. And I think what's the most important thing is, what's the company's ultimate goal? And sometimes the ultimate goal is, we're fighting this to the end, dead stop. At other times, the company's going to weigh cost. They're going to weigh whether or not there could be any unclarity if this was presented to a judge or a jury. And they're going to take into consideration their own evaluation of the facts and take it all together. It's never a single component. It's a standalone. And if I were a mediator, I'd be, I can see the frustration that you have to encounter in terms of, like, how do you diffuse that? Hard to know. I mean, you can always say, well, I hear you. That's something that usually comes up in my other mediations. You could give it. I mean, it's not unfair to sort of leverage a little bit your experience with other companies. Just, well, that's surprising. That's not my experience with other companies. They seem to think that's an irrelevant consideration.
Okay. And Mark, let's talk now about some other things that come up commonly in mediations. I'm very interested in your views. Sometimes as mediators, when we hit a deadlock, a point where it's hard to generate progress in a mediation, we do bracketing. We try to create simultaneous movement. If the defendant will come up to X, plaintiff comes down to Y simultaneously, nobody's bidding against themselves, it's contingent. There are some lawyers who think, oh, this is a wonderful way to generate progress in mediations. And there's some people who think it's just dreadful. I'm curious to know your views.
Yeah, I've seen it used effectively. We don't always do it, but I've seen it used effectively. I think when I was first introduced to it, I thought, oh, this is unusual. I think it gets back a little bit to my tenacity point earlier. I've seen some situations where, the brackets were whatever, wildly apart, and it didn't seem, people are like, well, forget the brackets, and it's like, I've seen situations where then all of a sudden the ice starts to melt and the brackets change and the overlap starts to occur. So it can be effective. We've been open to it in the right types of cases. And I mean, maybe a question to you, like, how, like, I'm sure you've had successful experiences with it, which is why you're asking, but, do you have any overall perspectives on it, for the group that's with us today, in terms of your own learnings from it, if you will?
Well, I'll just say briefly that one interesting thing about brackets is when somebody suggests a bracket, the human mind inevitably goes to the midpoint between the proposed offer and the proposed demand in the bracket,
Yeah.
and starts to draw inferences that perhaps that midpoint is about where the person would actually like to settle the case.
Right.
So because the human mind works that way and everybody knows it, it can be a nice, subtle way for people to communicate what they're really trying to accomplish in the mediation. And I find that it can accelerate things
Right.
greatly and lead to the ultimate bracket, if you will, or the ultimate simultaneous move,
Right.
which is the so-called mediator's proposal at the very end.
Right.
And again, we all know what that is, the double-blind number that a mediator may propose with or without consulting with people.
Right.
And you've no doubt had experience with mediators' proposals. When do they work? When do they not work? Do you like them, not like them? What are your views?
Right. Just getting back to the bracket point, I
Sure.
think one thing I've noticed is like sometimes like the notion of using the brackets is brought up, and okay, maybe then each side puts something on the table, and then I've seen situations where like looking at the other side's bracket, everyone's like, well, this is ridiculous. Like this is never going to work because of this, because of your point, this midpoint. I mean, look at their midpoint. Let's just, it's like, I don't care what their midpoint is. Like, in other words, you're in control of your own bracket, and you don't have to feel like just because the other side's still in outer space, that it's a lost cause. So again, I think you just kind of, you don't have to, but you can hang in there on the bracket. And eventually, maybe again, they'll come down through the stratosphere and back down, to 30,000 feet, and then maybe find that they're touching ground with you at some spot. So I think I've seen people get discouraged when they look at the other side's bracket and just say like, this is over, forget it. And it's like, no, you just continue to control your own bracket, or don't change your bracket the next move.
Yes, I think, Mark, the psychology of it in part is that just as you look beyond an individual bracket, you look beyond what might be extreme opening demands.
Right.
And my sense is that you're on the defense side most of the time, dealing with plaintiffs who perhaps are less seasoned in litigation than those on the defense side. They really have to feel that they've given it the college try to try to get that gold-plated number. And it's
Right.
only when they've beaten their brains out trying to get what they really want and not succeeded, whether through a bracket, a high demand, or otherwise, that they're willing to start considering other alternatives, which may be actually much more realistic in terms of about where the case ought to get resolved.
Right.
So I agree with you. Uh, you don't have to uh, you don't have to be hidebound to what the other side proposes as a bracket. There may be many reasons why they're doing it.
Right. Right. On mediator's proposal, at the right time, yes, I've seen them be effective. I occasionally we will have a situation where the suggestion to have a mediator's proposal seems to come too early in the day, if you will. And it is rare when we encounter a mediator who's sort of like, well, this doesn't look like it's going anywhere early in the day, and it's kind of like, that's just not gonna, we need time for things to kind of slow down a little bit. So anyway, my main point is we've seen them be effective, and it's usually it has to come later in the process at a point where it feels like in some way people have compromised enough that you see what the gap is. You have a belief of whether or not you're willing to go into some middle ground or not. And that can influence whether or not we'll say do a mediator's proposal, because we know what typically happens, and it's not unusual to get some sort of inkling of what that proposal is going to be or could be, and we'll have a viewpoint on it, and it may influence whether or not we'll agree to do a mediator's proposal at all.
So you want the mediator to consult with you as to whether to make a mediator's proposal at all?
Well, only in the sense of we've never had a situation where a mediator didn't first come in and say, I'm thinking of doing it. What do you think?
Uh-huh. And then does that conversation also include, I'm thinking of this number, that number. Is this something you might consider seriously, recommend to your client, et cetera? That kind of conversation as
I
well?
would say it's That piece, no. Like, in other words, it's usually, or maybe there's a separate conversation with our outside counsel, or there's typically some tea leaves that give us an indication of what we think. We might not know with certainty, but there's usually some sort of tea leaves that gives us a belief of what that proposal might look like, and that can influence whether we think we're going to say, yeah, do it or not. I mean, obviously there's no downside in the sense of we don't have to agree to it, whatever the mediator comes back with. But at times, I think maybe this is just psychological. We may not want a mediator's proposal, knowing that it sends some, it is a communication of sorts to the other side of what the mediator may think is a rational resolution. We may not agree with that, with those bounds, and we may not want that kind of communication to go to the other side.
And then what do you do in that case?
We pack up our bags and go home. I mean, I don't want to say that, but it may just be situation's not ready yet. It may be a day that concludes. Discussions could be ongoing in the upcoming days or weeks. We're obviously happy to use the day to accomplish certain things, but not have resolved the case.
And the fact that you may not have a settlement that day doesn't mean that the mediation has quote unquote failed, right?
Correct.
So when you're driving home after a mediation that has not resulted in a settlement, what are the things that are in your mind that lead you to think this was a good day or this was not a good day?
Right. Well, how the mediator performed is pretty top of mind. Like, did the mediator instill confidence in my team and my business colleagues in their performance, if you will? Did they demonstrate that they communicated with the other side in a fashion where they were heard, the mediator was heard, our position was heard, even if it didn't move the numbers, if you will? Did we learn something new of value to us in terms of our evaluation of the case? Has the company, and in particular the business involved, do they feel more knowledgeable through the process about what this dispute is and how it could potentially resolve, whether at mediation or at a trial? Did they hear some things that they hadn't heard before that are helpful to them, and they're thinking about the case? The lawyers have been thinking about it, but when the business people are alongside you thinking about it as deeply, that's success for me, and that can happen through a mediation. Both, it's like working up to the mediation, and all of a sudden you're working more with somebody, and then you spend that whole day with them, you're talking about the case, especially during those long breaks. And I guess in an odd way, when I'm reflecting about the day, it's like, am I closer to the business on this issue? Like, are we a closer partnership in our fight on this dispute? That typically will happen, and that's a good feeling, irrespective of how the mediation resolved. Now, all of a sudden, I've got somebody who's conscripted even closer to me on this matter, has sat through the other day, maybe heard something from the other side, heard something from the mediator, that they're getting the case in a way that they did not before.
So it's clarity.
Yeah.
Excellent. And if you could put out a word to the mediation communities, to something we need to do better. Mediators need to do better at this, or acquire this skill, or sharpen this skill. You folks really need to get to work on this. Where could we improve?
It's not an area for, I just think, the best mediations, or the best mediators, are the ones that instill strong confidence in the client in terms of that mediator and how their command of the facts. It's like, wow, that person really knew the case. Their ability to bring an outside perspective from a court and a jury and other matters that they've handled onto our matter. It's like, wow, even myself, I'm thinking, wow, they really brought some perspective around how this case could resolve with a court or jury that I hadn't quite thought about before. And and then there's the table stakes of just respect and just this is never underestimate how you appear with people and the impression they take from you, in your demeanor, how you carried off the day, moving things along. Our business people are busy, just sort of, so it's a bit of the project management of the day, if you will. Even that makes a difference, to our folks.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from our friend Tina Jones. Tina, would you consider unmuting yourself and asking your question directly?
Hi, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is, I'm curious about the neutral in the room. I wanted to find out what their qualifications are, what your expectations are from that person, what their background is.
Mm-hmm.
How do you select that person to be present, and what's the benefit? Why is it important to have that person present? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tina. We're looking at a variety of things in the person. Sometimes it's like, I don't know, our outside counsel has worked with that mediator in some other setting. So we've got some check the box on, we were impressed with this person and they helped us accomplish resolution in other matters. In terms of like whether or not they're a former judicial official, there's no right or wrong on that. I mean, we take note of it. If they were a former judge, maybe that can be helpful, but not always. But it's a credential. I'd say their experience, before becoming a mediator is, again, not irrelevant. If they, for example, if it's an employment case and they were a plaintiff's side lawyer, that's of interest to us. I mean, it could be, maybe we could view as that and say, like, that's going to be helpful maybe in some way with the other side, that they're going to, somebody had a plaintiff side background, and so they get what it's like to be a plaintiff. And so somehow or other, we could view that as helpful in our mediation. So we're looking at their background and experience before mediation. And then, as I said before, we try to get some intelligence from at least 2 or 3 sources on people's experience with the mediator and how they've performed.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for the question. Does anybody else have a question? We have a couple minutes left. You do. Anne, would you just unmute yourself and ask, please?
Thank you, Jeff. Mark, I'm Anne Breen Greco, and thank you for this excellent presentation. Full disclosure, I use Brita water system, and you've given us some things. Tina asked something of what I was interested in. So I wonder if you could give us maybe a worst case scenario with a mediator that's it, done, can't recover from that, will never use that person for some specific things said or done. Thank you.
I don't know if I could boil down to some specific thing said or done. Just as I talked about, I guess, client control, like there have been occasions where it feels like the mediator has no rapport, with the other side, and or I guess I'd call it that. Like I've had a limited number of situations where it felt like the mediator couldn't get through to the other side or had no ability to bring them along in any meaningful way, financially or otherwise. These could be things that are completely outside of the mediator's control, so I get that. But in those kinds of situations, it's hard knowing that, like in one case where that's happened, it's hard for me to think I'm going to use that mediator again, because I could, at least in the one matter I've had, it's like they couldn't do anything effective. So that's how I've kind of seen this end.
Okay. Mark, Danny, thank you very much. This is a tremendous presentation. I know that a lot of people will be moved to contribute to the Alameda County Community Food Bank in your honor. You can make those contributions online, friends. The website is www.accfb.org. That's www.accfb.org for the Alameda County Community Food Bank. On behalf of Jean Lawler, Natalie Armstrong-Motan, and Natalie's cat, who is on screen quite a bit today, and myself, Mark Danny, we want to thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And with that, we are complete.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Natalie, and great being with everyone today.